There is something deeply confusing about loving someone who pulls away the moment things start to feel real. At first, everything feels intense. The connection feels natural, almost effortless. Conversations flow, eye contact lingers. There is curiosity, excitement, and a strange emotional depth that feels rare. It feels like you have met someone who understands you in a way most people never have. But then something begins to shift. The messages become slower, the energy becomes colder. The closeness that once felt so easy now feels like something they are slowly stepping away from. You begin wondering what you did wrong. Maybe you became too open. Maybe you cared too much. Maybe you said something that scared them away. So you try harder. You reassure them that you care. You show them you are loyal. You prove that you would never leave them. You try to demonstrate that your feelings are stable, safe, dependable. You believe that if they truly understand how committed you are, they will finally relax and stop pulling away. But something strange happens. The more you try to prove you will never leave, the more distant they seem to become. It feels backwards, it feels unfair, and it leaves many people feeling emotionally exhausted, confused, and deeply hurt. What most people do not realize is that the psychology of avoidant attachment operates on a rule that almost no one talks about. It is a rule that contradicts the very thing people are taught about love and relationships. Avoidants do not relax when they believe someone will never leave. They relax when they know someone can. And this single psychological truth changes the entire dynamic of the relationship. Because when someone feels like they are trapped inside another person's emotional world, something inside them begins to panic. It does not always look like panic on the outside. Sometimes it looks calm, sometimes it looks distant, sometimes it looks like indifference. But internally, their nervous system is reacting to something that feels dangerously familiar: a loss of freedom, a loss of space, a feeling that someone else's emotional stability now depends on them. For someone with avoidant patterns, this is the moment when closeness stops feeling safe and starts feeling overwhelming. And when that feeling appears, distance becomes the only thing that brings relief. This is why so many people find themselves trapped in the same painful cycle. They try to hold tighter to keep the connection alive, but holding tighter only increases the pressure that makes the other person step further away. The truth is that avoidants do not need to feel that you will never leave them. They need to feel that you could, because only then does your presence begin to feel like a choice rather than an obligation. And that single shift changes everything about how they experience you. To understand this pattern, you have to understand what emotional pressure feels like inside the mind of someone who is avoidant. Most people associate love with closeness. They believe emotional security comes from knowing someone will always be there no matter what. They see loyalty and emotional dependence as proof that the relationship is meaningful, but avoidants often experience these same signals very differently. When someone begins to depend on them emotionally, a subtle alarm starts going off inside their mind. It is not because they lack feelings. In fact, many avoidants feel emotions very deeply. The difference is that emotional closeness quickly begins to feel like responsibility, and responsibility begins to feel like pressure. Imagine feeling like someone else's happiness is slowly becoming your job. Imagine sensing that if you pull away even slightly, the other person will feel devastated. Imagine realizing that your actions now have the power to completely destabilize another person's emotional world. For many avoidants, this realization is terrifying, not because they want to hurt anyone, but because they suddenly feel like they are carrying something they cannot control. And when people feel responsible for emotions they cannot manage, their instinct is to create distance from the situation. Distance becomes a form of self-protection. The more emotionally dependent someone appears, the more intense this pressure becomes. Even simple things like constant reassurance, repeated emotional conversations, or expressions of deep attachment can start to feel overwhelming. Again, this does not mean they do not care. In many cases, they care more than they are able to show. But caring combined with pressure creates an internal conflict that feels impossible to resolve. If they stay close, they feel trapped. If they pull away, they feel guilty. And when people feel trapped between guilt and pressure, their mind searches for the fastest escape route. That escape route is distance, which is why something surprising happens when the other person demonstrates that they are emotionally capable of leaving. The pressure disappears. Suddenly, the relationship no longer feels like something they are responsible for maintaining at all costs. Instead, it begins to feel like something both people are choosing to participate in freely. And freedom is the one thing avoidants value more than almost anything else. Most people enter relationships believing that the key to keeping someone close is proving how deeply they care. They believe that showing unwavering loyalty will make the other person feel secure. They believe that demonstrating how committed they are will strengthen the bond between them. In many relationships, this is true. But with avoidance, this approach often produces the exact opposite result. Because when someone signals that they would never leave under any circumstances, it removes something that avoidants unconsciously need in order to feel comfortable: choice. Choice is incredibly important to people with avoidant tendencies. Their sense of identity is strongly tied to autonomy and independence. The idea of being emotionally locked into something they cannot easily exit triggers a deep psychological discomfort. So when someone expresses unconditional attachment in a way that feels permanent or absolute, it can unintentionally create the feeling of being trapped. Not physically trapped, emotionally trapped. And when people feel trapped, their mind begins searching for space. But when someone is emotionally independent enough to leave, if the relationship stops being healthy or fulfilling, something very different happens. The dynamic shifts from obligation to voluntary connection. Instead of feeling like they must maintain the relationship to avoid hurting someone, the avoidant begins to experience the connection as something that exists because both people genuinely want it. This is an entirely different emotional experience. One creates pressure, the other creates respect. And respect is often the doorway through which avoidants begin to feel safe enough to move closer. Because respect signals strength. It signals that the other person has a life, identity, and emotional foundation that does not collapse if the relationship ends. And that kind of stability removes the hidden weight that avoidants often feel when someone becomes too attached too quickly. When the relationship feels like a choice instead of a necessity, curiosity begins to replace fear. And curiosity is something avoidants can move toward. Another hidden layer of avoidant psychology revolves around something many people never think about: emotional obligation. For someone who values independence above almost everything else, emotional obligation can feel incredibly heavy. When someone becomes deeply attached, avoidants often start imagining the future in a way that feels overwhelming. They imagine expectations growing stronger. They imagine conversations about deeper commitment. They imagine emotional needs becoming more frequent and more intense. In their mind, the relationship slowly transforms from something exciting into something demanding. And the moment a relationship begins to feel like a contract rather than a connection, their instinct is to regain control of their freedom. This is why many avoidants start creating distance exactly when things seem to be going well. To the other person, the timing feels confusing. Everything seemed perfect. The closeness was growing, the connection felt real. And then suddenly, the avoidant begins pulling away. But inside their mind, a different story is unfolding. They are imagining expectations that have not even been spoken yet. They are anticipating emotional obligations that may never actually happen. Their mind is trying to protect them from a future where they feel trapped by someone else's needs. So they create space before the relationship reaches that point. When someone demonstrates that they are emotionally capable of leaving, however, it changes the entire emotional atmosphere. Because now the relationship no longer feels like a one-sided responsibility. Instead, it becomes a shared experience where both people remain because they want to, not because they feel obligated to. This removes the invisible contract that avoidants often fear. And when that invisible contract disappears, so does much of the anxiety that drives their distance. One of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant behavior is that many of them are deeply attracted to independence in others. Not surface-level independence. Not the kind that is performed just to appear strong, but real emotional independence. The kind where someone has a full life outside the relationship. The kind where someone can care deeply about another person while still maintaining their own identity, their own direction, and their own stability. This kind of independence sends a powerful signal. It tells the avoidant that the relationship is not a cage. It tells them they are not responsible for holding another person's emotional world together. It tells them that the other person is capable of walking away if they are not treated well. And strangely enough, this realization often creates more attraction rather than less, because independence introduces something that avoidants deeply respect: self-worth. When someone shows that they are willing to leave rather than accept unhealthy dynamics, it communicates a level of emotional strength that avoidants rarely encounter. And strength is something they naturally move toward. It feels safe. It feels balanced. It feels like a connection between two people who both have the freedom to stay or go. And when a relationship reaches that point, something unexpected begins to happen. The avoidant no longer feels like they need to protect themselves from emotional pressure. Instead, they begin to feel curious about the person who has the strength to walk away but chooses not to. That curiosity slowly opens the door to something deeper, something more genuine. Because when someone knows you can leave, every moment you stay begins to mean something entirely different. And that curiosity leads to something many people in these dynamics have felt but never fully understood. There is often a specific moment when the avoidance energy toward you begins to change. It may not be dramatic, it may not be obvious at first, but something shifts quietly beneath the surface. Before that moment, the attraction often feels intense but unstable. The connection might start strong, full of deep conversations and emotional chemistry, but as soon as the other person begins leaning in more heavily, something in the avoidant begins leaning away. It is not because the attraction disappears. It is because the attraction becomes mixed with pressure, and pressure slowly suffocates the emotional space where attraction lives. When someone begins to sense that the relationship has become the center of the other person's emotional world, a subtle weight appears. The avoidant starts to feel like they are being watched more closely, needed more deeply, depended on more heavily. Even if those things are not explicitly said, they are often felt. And when that feeling grows, the avoidant mind begins trying to reclaim space. Messages become shorter, replies become slower, emotional conversations become something they start avoiding. They may distract themselves with work, hobbies, or social activities that create distance from the emotional intensity. From the outside, it looks like they are losing interest, but internally, they are trying to escape a pressure they cannot explain. This is why the dynamic changes so dramatically when the other person stops trying to secure the relationship through constant emotional investment. When the energy shifts from "I need this connection to survive" to "I value this connection, but I will be okay without it," something powerful happens. The emotional pressure dissolves. And when pressure disappears, attraction finally has room to breathe again. Suddenly, the avoidant no longer feels like someone else's emotional stability depends on them. Instead, they begin seeing the other person as someone strong, grounded, and self-sufficient. That shift changes how they feel about the connection, because attraction often grows strongest in the presence of emotional freedom. At the core of this entire dynamic lies something incredibly important to understand about avoidant psychology. Freedom is not just something they enjoy, it is something they emotionally require in order to feel safe. For many avoidants, early emotional experiences taught them that closeness often came with control, expectations, or emotional overwhelm. They learned that the deeper a relationship becomes, the harder it becomes to maintain their independence. So they adapted. They built a psychological system designed to protect their autonomy at all costs. They learned to rely on themselves. They learned to create emotional space when relationships began to feel consuming. They learned that distance often restored the sense of control that closeness threatened. Because of this, relationships only feel comfortable when they contain an element of voluntary participation. Avoidants need to feel like they are there because they want to be, not because they are trapped inside someone else's emotional needs. But here is the fascinating part. That same principle applies in the opposite direction. When they sense that someone else is choosing to stay rather than needing to stay, something changes inside them. The relationship begins to feel mutual instead of one-sided. It becomes a space where both people are present because they want the connection, not because they are afraid of losing it. That subtle difference transforms the emotional environment. Instead of feeling like they must manage someone else's attachment, the avoidant begins experiencing the relationship as something more balanced. And balance is one of the few emotional states where avoidants actually feel comfortable, allowing closeness to grow. When freedom exists on both sides, connection no longer feels dangerous. It feels possible. One of the most painful experiences people describe in these relationships is the feeling of chasing someone who constantly moves further away. At first, the chasing does not even feel like chasing. It feels like caring. It feels like making an effort. It feels like trying to protect something meaningful. You send the message first. You ask how their day was. You try to open deeper conversations. When they seem distant, you try to reassure them that you are not going anywhere. You believe that if they understand how safe your presence is, they will eventually stop pulling away. But what many people slowly realize is that the more they pursue closeness, the more the avoidant seems to withdraw. This dynamic is often called the pursue-withdraw cycle, and it can feel incredibly confusing if you do not understand what is happening beneath the surface. When someone pursues more intensely, the avoidant experiences that energy as increasing emotional pressure. Their mind interprets the pursuit as a sign that expectations are growing, that emotional needs are deepening, and that the relationship is becoming harder to step away from. So they instinctively move back to regain emotional breathing room. But the moment they move back, the other person feels the distance and moves forward again to close the gap. And the cycle repeats. The more one person moves closer, the more the other moves away, until eventually both people feel misunderstood. The pursuer feels rejected. The avoidant feels overwhelmed. What breaks this cycle is not more effort, it is the reintroduction of emotional space. When someone stops chasing and begins focusing on their own life, their own growth, and their own independence, something surprising happens. The pressure that was pushing the avoidant away begins to fade. And when the pressure fades, the avoidant sometimes begins moving closer again on their own. Not because they were manipulated, but because the emotional environment finally feels safe enough for them to return. There is another element that quietly transforms the way avoidants perceive someone: boundaries. For many people, boundaries feel risky in relationships. They worry that expressing limits might push the other person away. They fear that standing up for themselves might create conflict or distance. So instead, they tolerate behaviors that slowly erode their sense of self. They accept inconsistent communication, they accept emotional unavailability, they accept patterns that make them feel insecure because they are afraid that speaking up will make the other person leave. But ironically, the absence of boundaries often lowers respect in the eyes of avoidance. When someone tolerates everything without limits, it signals something they may not consciously recognize but still feel deeply. It signals a lack of self-protection. And when someone appears willing to sacrifice their own emotional well-being just to maintain the connection, it unintentionally creates the same pressure, avoidance fear, because now they feel responsible for someone who does not seem capable of protecting themselves. Boundaries change that dynamic completely. When someone calmly communicates what they will and will not accept, it sends a powerful signal of emotional strength. It shows that the relationship exists between two individuals who both value themselves. And when someone values themselves enough to walk away from unhealthy patterns, the connection becomes something that must be earned rather than assumed. Avoidance often responds strongly to this shift, because boundaries remove the silent expectation that they must manage the other person's emotions. Instead, the relationship becomes a space where both people are responsible for their own emotional stability, and that kind of balance is far less overwhelming. There comes a moment in many of these stories when something inside the person who has been chasing finally changes. At first, the shift is quiet. They stop checking their phone every few minutes hoping for a message. They stop analyzing every interaction, trying to decode hidden meanings. They stop rearranging their life around someone who seems unsure about being present. Instead, they begin turning their attention back toward themselves. They reconnect with friends, they invest energy into their own goals, they rediscover hobbies and passions that had slowly faded while they were trying to hold the relationship together. And as this happens, something surprising begins to appear: a sense of calm. For the first time in a long time, their emotional world no longer revolves around whether the avoidance stays or goes. They begin realizing something powerful. Their life does not collapse if the relationship ends. They are capable of walking away if they need to. And strangely enough, this quiet realization often changes how the avoidant responds to them. The energy shifts. Conversations sometimes become warmer again. Messages arrive more frequently. The emotional distance that once felt constant begins to soften. Not always, but often enough that the pattern becomes noticeable. Because when someone stops trying to prove they will never leave, the relationship stops feeling like a trap. Instead, it begins to feel like something fragile and valuable, something that could be lost. And the possibility of losing something meaningful has a way of awakening emotions that pressure often hides. When someone knows you can leave, your presence begins to carry a different weight. Every moment you stay becomes a choice. And that choice is something avoidants often respect far more than unconditional attachment. This is where one of the deepest emotional misunderstandings in these dynamics begins to reveal itself. Many people believe that showing someone they need them will make the connection stronger. They believe that expressing how much the relationship means will create deeper loyalty and emotional closeness. But for someone with avoidant patterns, the difference between wanting someone and needing someone can feel enormous. Wanting someone feels light, it feels free. It feels like two people standing beside each other, both capable of living their own lives, yet choosing to share space together. But needing someone feels heavy. It feels like responsibility, like pressure, like something that must be carried rather than enjoyed. When an avoidant begins to feel that someone needs them to feel okay, their nervous system often reacts immediately. They begin sensing expectations that may not even exist yet. They imagine future moments where they might disappoint the other person, where they might fail to meet emotional needs they never asked to be responsible for. And the more that imagined pressure grows, the more their instinct to create distance begins to activate. But when someone communicates a different energy, an energy that says, I care deeply about you, but my happiness does not depend entirely on this relationship, something shifts in the avoidance perception. That energy feels stable. It feels safe. It tells them that they are wanted, not required. And being wanted creates a completely different emotional atmosphere than being needed. Being wanted sparks curiosity. Being needed sparks fear. When an avoidant senses that the other person has a full emotional life beyond the relationship, it removes the silent weight that often pushes them away. It allows the connection to exist without the looming pressure of emotional dependency. And in that space, attraction can slowly begin to grow again, not because someone fought harder to keep them, but because the relationship finally feels like something both people are free to choose. Another quiet force begins to appear when someone reaches this point of emotional independence: mystery. In the early stages of many relationships with avoidance, there is often an intense sense of curiosity between both people. Each interaction feels unpredictable. Each conversation reveals something new. There is emotional discovery happening in both directions. But when one person becomes fully invested in proving their loyalty and presence, something about that mystery slowly disappears. Their feelings become completely visible. Their intentions become completely predictable. The avoidant begins to feel like the entire emotional landscape of the relationship is already known. There are no questions left to explore. And while predictability can feel comforting for many people, it sometimes reduces excitement for those who are highly sensitive to emotional pressure. When someone reclaims their independence, however, the dynamic subtly changes. They begin living their life again, without constantly seeking reassurance from the avoidant. Their attention shifts toward their own growth, their own friendships, their own goals. The avoidant begins to sense that this person's world is no longer orbiting around them. And suddenly a question appears in the avoidant's mind that was not there before. What are they doing now? Who are they becoming without me? That curiosity reintroduces something powerful into the dynamic. It restores the sense that the other person has a life that continues moving forward, whether the avoidant participates in it or not. And when someone realizes they are no longer the center of another person's emotional universe, their attention often begins returning in subtle ways. They become more present in conversations. They ask more questions. They begin observing the changes happening in the other person. Mystery has a way of reopening emotional doors that pressure once closed. Not because it is a strategy, but because independence naturally makes someone more intriguing. At some point in this journey, there is often a moment that feels almost invisible, but carries enormous emotional significance. It is the moment when someone stops trying to convince the avoidant to stay. This moment does not come from anger or resentment, it comes from clarity. After experiencing the cycle of closeness and distance, enough times something inside them begins to settle. They realize that chasing someone who is constantly unsure about the connection only drains their energy and self-respect. So instead of pushing harder, they simply step back. They stop initiating every conversation. They stop over-explaining their feelings. They stop trying to solve the emotional distance that the avoidant keeps creating. They allow silence to exist without immediately filling it. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable. It feels unnatural to stop reaching for someone you care about, but over time, it creates something that did not exist before: space. And space has a strange effect on relationships that were previously driven by pursuit. Without constant reassurance and emotional effort coming from the other side, the avoidant is left alone with their own thoughts about the connection. The emotional noise disappears, There is no longer someone trying to convince them to stay or pushing them to talk about feelings they are not ready to discuss. Instead, there is simply the quiet presence of someone who values the connection but refuses to chase it. That quiet presence often feels very different from the emotional intensity that existed before. It feels calm, it feels grounded, and sometimes in that calm space, the avoidant begins noticing something they were previously too overwhelmed to recognize. The connection still matters to them. There is also a fear that many avoidants carry but rarely express openly. From the outside, they often appear emotionally detached, independent, and comfortable with distance. They may even convince themselves that relationships are not as important to them as they are to others. But beneath that surface, independence often lies another fear that remains mostly hidden: the fear of losing someone they genuinely care about. Avoidants are often very skilled at suppressing emotions that feel overwhelming. When closeness begins triggering anxiety, their mind quickly shifts toward logic, distraction, or withdrawal. These coping strategies protect them from the immediate discomfort of emotional vulnerability. But they also prevent them from fully acknowledging how much someone might actually mean to them. As long as the other person continues chasing them, that hidden fear remains buried. The avoidant unconsciously assumes the connection will always be there, no matter how distant they become. But when someone stops chasing and begins focusing on their own life, something changes. For the first time, the avoidant senses that the relationship might actually disappear. The person who once seemed endlessly patient and available is no longer trying to hold everything together alone. And that realization can awaken emotions that were previously pushed aside. They begin thinking about the moments they shared, the conversations that once felt meaningful, the connection that felt rare. When the possibility of losing something becomes real, the mind often begins reevaluating its importance. This does not mean every avoidant will suddenly run back toward the relationship, but it does mean that your independence has revealed something powerful. Your presence was never guaranteed. And this leads to one of the most important truths about these dynamics. Emotional distance has never been about a lack of feelings alone. For many avoidants, distance is a coping strategy that developed long before the relationship even began. Somewhere in their early experiences, closeness became associated with discomfort, overwhelm, or loss of control. Perhaps emotional needs were dismissed, perhaps vulnerability led to pain, perhaps independence became the only reliable way to feel safe. Over time, the mind learns patterns that protect it from repeating those experiences. One of those patterns is creating distance whenever emotional intensity begins to grow. So when an avoidant pulls away during moments of deep connection, it is often not a conscious decision to hurt someone. It is an automatic response designed to restore emotional equilibrium. But when someone demonstrates that they are strong enough to walk away, the entire emotional context changes. Now, the avoidant is no longer the only one protecting their independence. The other person is protecting theirs as well. This creates a new kind of balance, a balance where neither person is trying to control the connection or force it into existence. Instead, the relationship becomes something fragile yet voluntary. Two individuals who both have the freedom to leave, but still choose to stay present with each other. And when a connection reaches that level of emotional freedom, something remarkable begins to happen. The walls that once felt impossible to approach start becoming a little less necessary. Because when someone knows you can leave, every moment you remain becomes a genuine expression of choice. And choice is the one form of closeness that rarely feels threatening to an avoidant mind. At some point in this emotional shift, something begins to change in the way the avoidant sees you. It is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, subtle, and often invisible to anyone outside the connection. But internally, their perception of you begins to evolve. Before this moment, they may have seen you as someone who would always be there no matter what they did, someone patient, someone understanding, someone willing to tolerate the distance, the mixed signals, and the emotional inconsistency. And while those qualities can come from a beautiful place of compassion, they sometimes create a dynamic where the avoidant feels unconsciously superior in emotional control. They believe they hold the power to decide when the connection moves forward and when it pauses. But the moment you demonstrate that you value yourself enough to step away if necessary, something changes in their mind. They begin to see you differently. Because walking away from something you care about requires strength. It requires self-respect. It requires the ability to tolerate uncertainty and still protect your own emotional well-being. And strength commands respect. Avoidants are often deeply sensitive to signals of self-worth in others. When someone shows that they will not sacrifice their identity or dignity just to maintain a relationship, it creates a new level of psychological balance. Now the connection is no longer built on one person holding everything together. It becomes a space where both people must show up intentionally. And when someone realizes that your presence is no longer guaranteed, they begin paying closer attention to the moments you are there. Your words carry more weight. Your silence carries more meaning. And your boundaries begin shaping the way they interact with you. Because respect changes how people treat each other. And respect often grows strongest when someone knows you are capable of leaving. When the emotional pressure disappears and respect begins to grow, something interesting can start happening on the avoidant side of the connection. Movement. Not always immediately. Not always in dramatic ways. But slowly, sometimes almost hesitantly, they begin moving closer again. You might notice them initiating conversations more often, asking questions about your life, showing curiosity about things they once seemed indifferent to. The emotional wall that once felt completely solid begins showing small openings. This shift does not come from being chased. It comes from the absence of pressure. For the first time, the avoidant is interacting with someone who is no longer trying to pull them closer or convince them to stay. The relationship feels calmer, less emotionally demanding, less intense in the way that once triggered their instinct to retreat. And in that calmer environment, something begins to awaken inside them, their natural curiosity. Avoidants often need emotional space to process their own feelings. When the relationship was filled with constant reassurance, conversations about commitment, or attempts to secure closeness, their mind remained focused on escaping the pressure. But once that pressure disappears, their attention becomes free again. Free to wonder, free to observe, free to reconnect at their own pace. This is often when the avoidant begins approaching the relationship differently, not as something they must protect themselves from, but as something they can explore without feeling trapped. And when someone chooses to move closer without being pushed, that closeness carries a completely different meaning. It is voluntary. It is authentic. And it often feels more genuine than anything that could have been forced. What begins to emerge at this stage is a delicate balance that many relationships struggle to find. The balance between space and connection. Too much pursuit creates pressure. Too much distance creates disconnection. But when both people maintain their individuality while still allowing emotional closeness to exist, something stable begins to form. For avoidance, this balance is essential. They often thrive in relationships where emotional intimacy grows gradually, rather than being rushed. They feel more comfortable when the connection expands naturally without constant demands for reassurance or immediate clarity about the future. This does not mean their partners must suppress their own emotional needs. It simply means that closeness develops more sustainably when both people maintain a sense of personal autonomy. When someone has their own life, their own passions, their own friendships, and their own emotional grounding, the relationship becomes an addition rather than a foundation. And additions feel lighter. They feel voluntary. They feel like something you can enjoy rather than something you must constantly maintain. This balance allows the avoidant to remain emotionally engaged without feeling like their independence is slowly disappearing. At the same time, it allows the other person to maintain their sense of identity without sacrificing their emotional well-being. When both people stand firmly within their own lives while still reaching toward each other, the relationship begins to feel less like a struggle and more like a choice made every day. And daily choice is far stronger than forced commitment. There is an important misunderstanding that often appears when people hear the idea that avoidants need to know you can leave. Some people interpret it as a strategy or a tactic designed to make someone chase them. But that interpretation misses the deeper truth completely. Walking away from unhealthy dynamics is not manipulation, it is self-respect. The purpose is not to create fear or control someone's behavior. The purpose is to remain emotionally honest with yourself about what you deserve. When someone stays in a relationship while constantly ignoring their own needs, they slowly disconnect from their own sense of worth. They begin accepting patterns that make them feel smaller, less valued, less secure. But when someone acknowledges that they are capable of leaving, if the relationship stops being healthy, they reclaim something incredibly powerful: their dignity. And dignity changes how people show up in relationships. It changes the tone of conversations. It changes the energy of interactions. It removes desperation and replaces it with calm clarity. When someone carries themselves with the quiet understanding that they deserve mutual effort and respect, others begin responding to that energy differently. Not because they were forced to, but because the relationship now exists between two individuals who both value themselves, and relationships built on mutual self respect often feel far more stable than those built on emotional dependency. At the heart of everything we have explored lies a simple truth that many people never hear while navigating these complicated connections. Avoidants do not need someone who will never leave. In fact, that idea often creates the very pressure that pushes them away. What they truly need is something much more subtle and much more powerful. They need to know that the person standing in front of them has the strength to walk away if they are not treated with care, respect, and honesty. Because when someone stays, even though they have the freedom to leave, that presence carries a completely different meaning. It is no longer based on fear. It is no longer based on emotional dependence. It becomes a conscious choice made again and again. And choice is the purest form of connection that exists. When someone knows you could leave but continue showing up with honesty and openness, your presence becomes something meaningful rather than something expected. It becomes something that must be valued rather than taken for granted. And sometimes that realization is the very thing that allows an avoidant to lower their defenses for the first time. Not because they were pressured to stay, but because they finally feel safe enough to choose the connection themselves. Because when freedom exists on both sides, love no longer feels like a cage. It feels like two people standing side by side, both capable of walking away, yet both deciding that this connection is worth staying for.